All right, so we're down on the book, so you guys can take a look and follow along. Again, chapters 12. If you're in the old book, so I'll start in the old book. Turn to chapter 12, which is on page. What page is that? Chapter 12 is 201. Jump up to page 201. All right, transmission service, in-vehicle service. Probably the most common thing you guys are going to be asked to do in vehicle service would be a transmission, maintenance or service. Basically, if a vehicle comes in, customer wants a transmission service, you are going to, change the fluid and filter if it's got one. Most manufacturers have an internal filter. Some manufacturers will put an external filter on, but the majority of them will do an internal filter. And at that point, you just go ahead and drop the pan, change the fluid. Very few manufacturers actually put a drain plug in the pan. Some do. It's nice that they do. But in a lot of cases, they don't. So you have to actually physically remove the pan. So if you can take a look at this picture right here, it's kind of a messy job. So if you're going to do one of those, just be aware you need a large transmission drain pan. So it's usually a large, almost looks like the top of a trash can, sets on your drain bucket, catches as much fluid as you possibly can. Importance of changing a fluid. This is something that needs to be maintained. It is not a high frequency deal. In some cases, it can be as far as 100,000 miles. In some conditions, if you're in a heavy duty use condition, you may actually find, like frequently towing vehicles or plow vehicles, you may actually find the intervals will drop down to maybe as low as 30,000 miles. But right around 50 to 100,000 miles with most manufacturers recommend changing the fluid. If you're in a situation where you're using the truck heavy, just go ahead and change a little bit more. High temperature characteristics of fluid. This is a really good chart in your book. It'll actually show you what happens to transmission fluid as you run the temperature higher. Again, 100,000 miles life in a fluid, as long as you keep that fluid under 175 degrees ambient temperature, or 175 degrees fluid temperature. As you start beating on your truck, you get into a trailer tow situation, you can actually drop down that fluid life, and you're going to have to run it a little bit more. So I guess if you're a commercial application, truck application, heavy duty, towing application, you may want to change it more frequently. It is probably something that's a good thing to do. If you buy a new car, you want to go ahead and change the fluid. You don't know what the fluid service has been done. Or if you're in a situation where you run into, you buy a used car, those types of things. Another thing you got to be kind of aware of is sometimes by changing the fluid, you introduce a tremendous amount of detergent, which could actually cause some particulates that are in the pan or are stuck within the transmission to actually start floating around. So if you are in a situation where you know the car's got a ton of miles on it, just be aware if you do just change the fluid, you may be breaking some stuff loose. I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm just saying just be aware of that. The best thing to do is obviously from the time you purchase the vehicle to maintain it properly and do the fluid changes when required. But if you get something that's out of that range, just kind of be aware of that. Again, drop in the pan. I usually take it for a drive first. I usually get the fluid hot. Oil will suspend particles within the transmission, so if you do drive the vehicle and get the fluid moving around, sometimes you'll suspend some particles, and then when you do a transmission service, whether it's a drain plug or a pan drop, you can actually get a lot more of the crud out of there if you go ahead and drop it when it's warm after a test drive. So that's really what you're doing. Pull the filter off. The filter itself may be retained several different ways. There may be screws in there, maybe little clips. I will tell you a lot of manufacturers are dealing with an inlet tube that goes in some cases, directly into the valve body or into the front pump. And that inlet tube sometimes will have a seal. And that seal itself, even though you get one with the filter kit, you may want to consider reusing the old seal, because in some cases the process of servicing the seal, pulling the seal out and changing it, can damage either the seal of the pump or just kind of give you a fit. So a lot of times when we'll do the tranny service, I'll pull the filter out. If the seal looks good, you put your finger up in there. If the seal lip is pliable still, and you think it'll work well with that new filter, just go ahead and slide the new filter in. Maybe put a little assembly gel on the seal so you don't roll anything. But you go ahead and put the filter back in, put the retaining screw on. Some manufacturers, I know Chrysler does it, and I know that I've seen a couple imports that do it too. They'll have a cartridge style screw-on filter along with a traditional style element style filter, which kind of looks like that. Okay, and then you'll have somewhere on the transmission, either externally or internally, some sort of cartridge style filter. It looks like an oil filter you see on an engine. If you do have one of those, you may actually want to get into a situation where you look at the recommendations. Sometimes they recommend replacing both. Some manufacturers recommend, like every other tranny service, the screw-on filter needs to be changed. I know in the 45 RFE that we build in our 371 class, that one has 2 filters, and the screw-on filter is only required every other tranny service, which is kind of interesting when you try to quote that to a customer. Every other service is going to cost a little more. So drop the fluid, obviously put the filter back on, put the pan on. Pans themselves, right now, most manufacturers right now are using really good gasketing surfaces. They're either using a really good RTV to seal the pan, or they're using some sort of butyl or some sort of rubberized silicone style seal that's in some cases even reusable. I know we've developed over the years reusable pan gaskets in some of our vehicles, but definitely make sure you replace the gasket, replace the sealer, clean it very well. If you're using an RTV, make sure you're using a transmission grade room temperature vulcanizing RTV. Make sure you're using that. Got to get it clean. I find in a lot of cases, just getting in there with a scraper will get it clean. A lot of techs will use a whizzer wheel, one of those pneumatic whizzer cleaner discs. You got to be careful with that because that throws a lot of particulates around. So if you're cleaning off a gasket surface on an aluminum transmission with a whizzer tool, like a surface like this, if you're to clean that surface off, or a surface like this, a lot of times you can actually throw some material inside the transmission when you're doing that process, which is not good at all. So I'd recommend using a scraper. Get as much of the goo off as you possibly can. Wipe it down with some brake clean on a rag. Make sure it's nice and dry. Get as much of the tranny fluid out of there as you possibly can. And then go ahead and put the new RTV on the pan, and then reinstall the pan. Start all the screws by hand, and then go ahead and bring them on tight as you go through. Watch for stripped out screws because that's a real common area. It's okay to blow them off with an impact gun if you've got a cordless deal. If you're using a pneumatic or a battery operated dealio, you can use that. Just make sure when you go back in, you're gonna finish those up by hand. You do not want to run these in with a tool, because in a lot of cases you'll strip the screws out that retain the pan, and you just ruined your day. So again, a high failure rate item on these fasteners. So just make sure you're watching your torque. If you get one that's bad, take the time and put a nice helicoil fix in it. It's a good idea to do that. I think we've covered that in lab, but if you don't, let me know and I'll send you a video on how to do that. But definitely want to helicoil those threads if you get one this week. Again, that's pretty much your transmission service. There are some manufacturers and some of the aftermarket guys that are doing what they call a transmission fluid exchange or a flushing unit. Want to talk about this. This came out about 15, 20 years ago. It was real popular. A lot of the aftermarket shops were picking up on it. A lot of the chemical companies were offering flushing agents and different solvents and things you can run through your transmission. And basically what you do is you bring a vehicle in, you would put this additive in your transmission that acted like a solvent or a flushing agent. Then you drive the vehicle, bring the vehicle back in, and then connect it to a machine. And it looked like an air conditioning machine, and it's got a couple of hoses on it. And usually there's a couple of large reservoirs. One reservoir you'd fill up with new transmission fluid. The other reservoir would be the waste fluid coming from the transmission. So basically what this thing would do is, as the transmission sat there and idle and created hydraulic pressure, it would normally push fluid out to the exchanging machine, fill up the waste reservoir in the exchanging machine. And at the same time, the machine that you were using would pump clean new transmission fluid back in the inlet side of the cooler line. And the advantage of this is according to the manufacturer's machine, it would actually change more fluid, and it would exchange. They would concur that it would exchange 100% of your fluid in your transmission, unlike a pan drop, which you may only drop. If you got a 12-quart transmission, you may only drop 4 quarts out in a tranny service. So in this, or maybe more than that, probably 6 or 8 quarts. But the reality is you're not getting it all out. By using a transmission flushing machine or exchanging machine, you would typically change more fluid. You have a higher volume of fluid being changed. And I'm okay with that. I mean, I'm not against the procedure. I think the procedure is valid. I kind of have a problem with over-servicing vehicles, but, it is an expensive service because you're changing a heck of a lot more fluid. But, again, you're changing more fluid, so you're going to be paying a little bit more. The only problem I have is the flushing solvent, because there is not a manufacturer out there that I found that recommends using any type of aftermarket transmission fluids, flushing additives, solvents, or anything in your transmission. If you were to do that, you could actually get into a situation where you could contaminate clutches, cause issues. Again, you're flushing gunk that may be normally built up in a transmission that wouldn't cause any problems, but because you put a solvent in, you've actually broken it loose so it can float around now in the transmission. So I'm not a big fan of that. I would recommend being careful with that part of it. I'd almost recommend doing the exchange, but not doing the additive, not doing the solvent, which a lot of the companies, there's actually companies out right now that give the shop the machine, and then the idea is you buy the solvents from them, you buy the additives from them, and so there's a company called BG's, and they really tout that. They have basically flushing machines and solvents for all kinds of different applications. They've got them for power steering, they've got them for brakes, they've got them for all kinds of different things. So, like I say, it's I'm not going to tell you not to do it because I know a lot of shops will sell it, but I will tell you on my car, I'd probably not put the solvents in. I may actually exchange the fluid because I want to get all the fluid changed, not just a portion of it. But remember, the manufacturer only recommends doing a pan drop and a filter change. They know how much fluid comes off when you do a pan drop, so they're not that concerned about it. But just be aware of that. So again, those are flushing, exchanging machines. In your book, kind of gives you some case studies and some different stories about that, procedures and how to do it. Each machine is a little different. I've heard some horror stories though. I've actually seen guys that'll hook this machine up wrong, starve the transmission for fluid, and in the process of just doing a maintenance on it, they ruin the guy's transmission. So make sure you know what the heck you're doing. Another thing I've seen too is because a lot of these cars in the Northeast, the fittings for the cooler lines are subject to corrosion and sometimes the process of connecting the machine to the cooler lines. I've heard of people damaging coolers, damaging transmission inlet lines, cooler lines, which can be very expensive. And then also these attach directly to the radiator. In some cases, the radiator fitting itself can get damaged. Now you got a $400 radiator to put on the list of parts the guy needs. So again, be careful with that. I would consult the procedure manual and talk to your service manager, see what they want you to do. So, all right, the next thing they talk about in the book, they talk about seal replacement. Again, seals in a transmission, obviously external seals. This is showing a seal puller, just kind of a general service procedure. Pop the seal out, pop the new seal in. Not a big deal, pretty easy service. Sometimes it's even harder to get the axle shaft out than it is to actually service and change the seal. One thing I will recommend to you, though, is before you sell just a seal, this is some sort of axle seal, before you sell the seal, make sure it's the seal that's actually bad. Some cases it could be the shaft that's in the assembly. Maybe the bushing's bad inside the assembly, so the seal's walking up and down. You have too much lateral run out, or maybe you got some end play in that thing it's sifting out, and that's what actually causing the leak. Another thing that's really popular for causing things like pinion seal leaks and axle seal leaks, and some output shaft seal leaks, stuff like that, is the vent for the assembly is plugged. All of your powertrain assemblies, whether it's a transmission, transfer case, axle, I don't care what the heck it is, it's going to have a vent. And that vent is to allow for normal expansion and contraction of vapors and gases that may be within the assembly. So if you're in a situation where this axle seal is leaking, Shaft looks okay. It's not rusted. You know, everything looks fine. Find the vent. Make sure the vent's clear. Go ahead and sell the seal. Seals just wear out over time. You get some miles on them and they just wear out. The axle shaft that goes in there or whatever goes in there, make sure that's clean and free from rust. If it is rust pitted, you can usually clean it up with some mild sandpaper, you know, or some crocus cloth, or those green scrubby pads can knock the rust off. Put a little CRC or some I don't know, what do they call that? Any rust penetrant WD or whatever on the rag or the sandpaper, and kind of sand that rust down. I usually put some trans-assembly gel, or in this particular case, you could probably put a little bit of grease on there too, and then go and put that shaft back in there. The grease and the assembly gel kind of keep that seal from rolling over. External seals are usually work a little bit better with grease than the internal, obviously, tranny seals. But you know, you got a big heavy rubber seal like that, you can probably put a grease on the shaft, so when you put it in, it doesn't you know, roll the seal as you put it in. Some manufacturers will have specific seal savers, which are little sleeves that go on the inside of the shaft, so when it goes in, it keeps the lip seal from rolling over. You don't see that much on axle shafts, but you know, some of the internal stuff you'll see. But go ahead and knock in a new seal. I usually find a seal installer that will catch the outside edge of this retainer and tap that guy back in there, and that should work out pretty good for you. Remember, you're only going to be tapping on the metallic. You don't want to tap on the rubber part of it. Also, the squarer you can put this in, the better. If you got to tap around with a hammer in a circle like this, sometimes you'll get this thing cattywampus and it'll get all, it won't be in there square and it'll leak. I usually try to find, if you can't find anything that'll go on here like a seal installer, get yourself a big socket that'll go over the edge of that. Just tap that in. You know, black pipe or, you know, anything you got kicking around the shop to get that on will be fine. If you work at a dealer, there's probably a specific seal installer for each one of these seals, so you'll find that where you're at. So, but again, there's a good section here on just general seal replacement. Excuse me as I get a cup of coffee here. It's just so weird teaching like this because nobody's asking questions. So again, if you've got questions, shoot me an email. But again, we're doing the best we can with this. Extension housing seals, and that's what you're going to be doing. It shows a dude here with the cool gloves on, a little grease on the seal as he puts it in. This is another thing too, if you're pulling a transmission and you pull the transmission axle shaft out, or you're pulling something out, you can get these little cups that go in here. These are great. The only concern I have with these is sometimes these don't fit the shaft, and when you put them in there, you knock the little spring, they call it a garter spring, on the inside of that seal off. So then when you put it back together, it actually leaks. So watch out for that. So you want to be careful with that as you go through there. So, okay. The next section the author gets into is manual lever linkage stuff. Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously it's a cable and it goes to the transmission, controls the shifter. That's going to be something you're going to have to adjust. Again, look at the manufacturers. About 1,000 different ways that manufacturers over the years have done the adjustment on this. It could be as easy as just a fastener you loosen and retighten when the transmission's in neutral. I find in most cases when you do some sort of linkage adjustment, for some reason it's a neutral adjustment. So you put the transmission in neutral, you put the shifter in neutral, and then retighten the fastener, and at that point you've got it adjusted properly. So. But that's that linkage adjustment, so you guys can go ahead and mess around with that. Once you get an adjustment, if you think you have it right, there's a couple things you want to watch for. You want to make sure the vehicle starts up in neutral, and to make sure the starts up in park. That verifies that you got your neutral safety adjustment in there correctly. You also want to make sure that the vehicle holds correctly in park. Now, really, the best way to do that is to find a little grade on a hill, put the vehicle up in what you think is parked, and then take your foot off the brake, and you're going to listen to the parking mechanism and engage and hold the vehicle. So as long as it starts in neutral, starts in park, doesn't start in any of the other gears, and it holds in park, you probably got it right. Obviously, you want to make sure the shift indicator, if you have a shift indicator on the dash, make sure all that stuff works pretty good. But those types of things you want to watch for too. Another thing you want to watch out for too, and I never thought about it until just now, is you also want to make sure this thing does not come out of park unless the key is on and your foot is on the brake. Okay. I guess there is a possibility you can have everything adjusted and test everything I just told you to test, but you could be in a situation where the gate didn't engage or lock, and then potentially the vehicle be put into gear without applying the brake, I guess. So just be aware, most manufacturers today require brake application and obviously key on to get the vehicle out of gear. Key just to make sure nobody's stealing your car, and then brake application just so the customer realizes they're putting the car in gear. A lot of the older vehicles, when I say older, 2002s, my Jeep will do this. You can actually grab my Jeep and throw it in gear without putting your foot on the brake. I actually think it's broke, but back in the day, a lot of cars did that. So, it's something you want to check out. You shouldn't be able to do that. I know there's a lot of lawsuits. Manufacturers have been sued by customers that have actually been able to get out of their car and not put the vehicle in park. So some cars today, if you have an electronic braking system or parking braking system, a lot of those systems, as soon as you open the driver's door, it'll engage park. It'll engage the parking brakes for you and prevent you from killing yourself. So, all right, the bottom of here talks about powertrain mounts. Obviously, this is more so for vehicles that are front-wheel drive, but I guess you could center them. You'll notice if you've ever taken a front-wheel drive vehicle motor mount out or any type of accessory that attaches to the chassis with the transmission, you'll notice there's quite a bit of an adjustment. There's quite a bit of slotting in the motor mounts. The reason for that is obviously as they build up a car, those sheet metal pieces are all welded together. In some cases, they don't weld them perfectly, or they're not jigged correctly. So there may be a left to right movement of that transmission that may have to occur. So after they install it, you may have to center that engine in the cradle assembly. This is a really kind of extreme example, but the author in here was talking about the inner CV joints. Now, I've only seen this happen once, and I believe it was caused by a vehicle that was in an accident. But what was happening is the vehicle engine and transmission were placed in the vehicle one way too far or the other way too far. And what was happening is the inner part of the inner CV joint was actually bottoming out only on turns. So the vehicle would shift slightly, the engine would shift slightly in the normal motor mount movement, cradle would move, everything's going to be rubber insulated to cut down the vibration. And what would happen is the engine assembly would slide over, and this would actually bottom out, and it would feel like you had a flat tire. It was boom, 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 really bad. So what we did is we actually came in and we just kind of loosened up the motor mounts, got a big pry bar and put a jack stand, jacked the engine up and pried this engine over, retightened everything, we just shifted it over and gave equal amount of clearance on both sides. And what that does, it prevented that from occurring. We did have a procedure at one time that we actually loosen the axle nut. You got to kind of be careful with that because you can damage a wheel bearing. But if you loosen the axle nut and push in on the axle, we actually called it a plunge measurement, where you actually plunged the outer CV joint in past the bearing and measured how far it went in. And you did the same thing on the other side. You compared the readings, and you wanted equal movement on both sides. And what you were plunging is as you push in on that axle shaft and push in, what you're doing is bottoming out the spring on the inside of this inner CV joint. So you could probably do this in the air if you wanted to. Put the car in the air, loosen the nut up, push in on it on both sides, and make sure that it plunges equally. This particular vehicle, it probably wouldn't be as effective in the air because everything's hanging down. It's going to be looser. But this particular vehicle, if you pushed it on one side, you would get a lot of movement. On the other side, you got hardly any, and that's what's bottoming out the shaft. So, again, we just recentered the engine, fixed it. This particular vehicle had CV joints put in it. It had a torque converter put in it. They were about to pull the transmission and do a differential assembly because it was more so on turns. So they were thinking maybe something in the spider gear, but it actually turned out to be the inner CV joint bottoming out. So, but that's kind of how that works. Adjustments, you guys have already done band adjustment. We did that in lab, so you guys understand how to do band adjustments. You're getting less and less of that. You're probably not going to find too many vehicles out there that have a band or require that as an adjustment, but all right, the latter half of this, they talk about a training service. Again, we'd probably doing this in lab, but you guys, that's how we do it. You drop the pan, you put the new sauce in there. Another thing you got to watch out for, too, is make sure that you're measuring transmission fluid level correctly. All kinds of variations in automatic transmission fluid level today. A lot of cars today, you're not just pulling the dipstick. In most cars, I would say in general, most cars, you would start the vehicle in park. Some vehicles you do it neutral, but again, fair number of them today you're going to do it in park. Start the vehicle up, get it fully warm, wipe the stick, put the stick in, take the stick out. You're doing this with the engine running, okay? Again, most vehicles. Looking in the you know, the more modern vehicles today, there are some where you can't even, they don't even give you a dipstick. The dipstick is part of a special tool package. You got to go to the dealer to get the dipstick. There's a little plastic cover on the tube that says go to your dealer and have them check it. The Scat Pack that we got down in the lab, that 8-speed, it actually has a fastener on the outside of the transmission that you remove, and you add fluid until fluid comes out of that fastener, and that's kind of how you check. You have to actually have fluid to check fluid level. It's kind of a weird deal, but you got to use a scan tool, measure transmission fluid temperature. There's a whole bunch of stuff you got to do. So, but that's pretty much of that chapter. I would ask you guys, let's get the review questions done for this and chapter quiz questions. Go and email me these. This is going to be due to me Sunday by 9 o'clock. So that's pretty much of that. That dealio. So that pretty much completes that. Again, if you have any additional questions as we go through with these videos, you know, shoot me an email. Again, you guys have my email. Not a big deal. So, but that's pretty much that first chapter. Now let's see if we can blow through this other chapter. This is transmission transaxle removal and disassembly. The disassembly stuff you guys have already done. Okay. But I do want to spend a little bit of time with this. This is actually kind of important thing. This is a repair option, and this is actually probably gonna be something I'll get into a little bit later in the next lecture. But when you have a transmission that fails, your transmission in your car, let's say you're the customer and your transmission fails, you've got some options. Obviously, you guys would assume that it would be most prevalent to take the vehicle in and have the vehicle disassembled, verified. You know, obviously it needs to be repaired, and then have a guy take it apart and fix it and put it back together. Believe it or not, that option is becoming less and less the case. Most shops, or most smaller independent shops, or even most, you know, medium-sized to small dealers, do not have the skill level necessary to rebuild transmissions, or the tools, or the parts, or the time. It's becoming a fair option for independent shops and repair facilities to either replace the unit, and then depending on which way you can go with a remanufactured transmission, or a new transmission, or a used transmission. Or they pull the tranny, maybe send it out to a remanufacturer place and have them build it, and they sublet it and bring the transmission back in and put it back in for the customer. That's a possibility. But the remanufactured transmission is becoming very, very popular today. Very similar to what you guys are doing for pretty much every other part in the car. Whether it's an axle shaft, an alternator, or starter, or whatever, you guys are probably going to be not rebuilding those components. You're probably going to be putting a remanufactured unit in. So the same thing happens with transmissions. If my transmission fails, I can get a remanufactured unit. It usually comes with a warranty that's actually better than the shop warranty that I have back at the shop. So in a lot of cases,